Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have the next episode of Recent Reads. I forget the number. I think 18, might be 17, whatever it is. This is the next episode. And I have quite a few books to talk about. And I have to remember to talk about at least one of them that I don't have a physical copy of. So this week I read, well, I'm working through my third audiobook. So I read completely 2 audiobooks. One of them took most of the week. And then physically I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books. So yes, I did end up with 2 more than last week. Did I have any more time to read this week? No, but I think I was helped in the fact that I had easier, shorter books to read this week. When I film my wrap up, I'm gonna have quite a few books to talk about. It might be the most books that I've read in a regular month. I think last summer I did get a lot of books in July or June, but setting that aside, back to the books for this week. My goal was to work through the last of my quote unquote required reads on my TBR. I had some SESL books and I had a handful of, well, just one magical readathon book, and I think that was the demonology prompt, which kind of fits for the book it is, but I'll talk about that when I get to it. So all of these were in my genre for my team for Realmathon. I did 2 readathons this month, so that's a lot. It's in the waning hours of both of these readathons. I read quite a few, packed in a lot of books here towards the end, and I think I might need to slow down. So let's talk about these books. 2 of them are SESL books. I read a 3rd one last week, and so I'll talk about those first. First of those is Fallout by Steve Sheinkin. This is a nonfiction book. If I remember correctly, it's the only nonfiction on both the junior or middle grade and young adult list. This is on the middle grade, the junior list, and the Cold War is not an area of history, world, or US that I'm particularly drawn to, but this book told that story really well. There's a lot that you can talk about that went on during the Cold War, a lot. And he skims the surface without omitting crucial details and gets you interested in it, and has a lot of primary sources, primarily photographs, although there is one map in here. So I did use this for a magical readathon read when I had to postpone listening to the Terraformers because of Scrib's lovely unlimited policy. But the thought going through my head, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about this in my SESL video, I don't know how many middle schoolers would necessarily want to pick up this book. I genuinely don't know how big of an audience it would reach, just because they don't tend to read a lot as it is. I can think of one student that I taught that probably would be really interested in this. I taught him last year, I think. Nonfiction is just not their thing, and stuff about the Cold War, it doesn't have necessarily the same attention grabbing. However, the design of the cover is really well done, and the way that Sheinkin tells the story is also really well done. And I learned a couple things in here. So my attention was engaged throughout. I thought he did a really good job at telling the story age appropriately without dumbing it down and sounding like it's dumbed down. So I did really enjoy this. I just struggle to see the appeal for middle schoolers. At least it should be interesting to them, you know. Age-old dilemma. The other of the SESL books that I read this month is Stowaway. So this is sci-fi. I did pick out all of the sci-fi reads. I returned Project Hail Mary. I knew I wouldn't have any time for that. Yes, that Project Hail Mary is on the young adult list. I have no idea how to make that make sense. Anyway, back to Stowaway. So there were 2 of the middle grade books that were sci-fi centered. There was The Lion of Mars, where it's a colony that's set up on Mars. And as I mentioned last week, it was the last book I read that week, and it was a real big disappointment. This one was not. This one wasn't like spectacular, amazing. I think I have to come to the conclusion that sci-fi is not my genre. I can enjoy it, but it's never going to win me over, at least not space opera sort of sci-fi. But it was really well told. In this book, aliens have made contact with humans. There's this element there's a lot of on Earth. They're using it, humans are using it, there's space travel, they're working together. And of course, in the back of your mind, are they really being charitable? And humans end up teaming up, making a partnership, joining the coalition. And when they do, they realize there's a war going on, a massive war, and they get sucked up into this. And the opposing force seems like the big bad villains, they're always evil, etc. Whenever anything is painted in pictures as black and white as that, there's got to be more to the story. So there's an attack from the villains that happens that actually kills the mother of the main character on here. And the father is a world-renowned, universe-renowned scientist who works with this desired element. And he ends up on a research ship. But then the research ship is attacked by the villains, and the only thing that they steal, they trash everything, they take the element which enables faster than light travel, and they take the dad. And so the main character and his brother are there, and he ends up stowing away on a pirate ship, which comes to take what's left. They don't get anything, well, they get a stowaway. And so he's trying to get back to his father, and that's the driving conflict in this story, which turns out to be a series, which I did not know at the outset. I have since discovered it is a duology. This book was published in 2021. The conclusion to the duology was published last year, so I may or may not at some time in the future get the second book in the duology. This book, the plot moves so fast, but not too fast. And then at the same time, think about every kind of trope that you've seen in sci-fi movies, TV shows, etc. The pirate captain is very Han Solo-esque. There's all sorts of tropes that fill and are stuffed into this book. I could predict just about everything that happened, but not necessarily in a bad way. So I think that the pace of this would really engage a lot of middle grade readers. I had an enjoyable time as an adult reader who's read a lot, who knows a lot of these tropes. So I think that would definitely be a hit among the target demographic. I just, very predictable. I think I rated this 3.5 stars, but a very high 3.5 stars. I think I also rated Fallout 3.5 stars. So they have had about the same, and more of that was enjoyment than necessarily quality. Next, we come to the audiobook that I read for most of the week. And with this book, I have determined one of my favorite authors now. I found a new favorite author. I found a couple last year. That's Justina Ireland. Because my Buzzwordathon book for this month was emotions. So that was the keyword in the title. And so I chose Dread Nation. I knew about this series after I'd looked into Justina Ireland, especially after my brother-in-law and sister had gotten Ophi's Ghost for me last Christmas or the Christmas before, because he had read this duology and loved it and was surprised that she had a middle grade book. And I read the synopsis and didn't necessarily think that it would be something for me, but because I loved Ophi's Ghost so much, I did put it on my TBR tentatively, and then I ended up putting it on my Buzzwordathon list. I'm gonna pick it up. Wouldn't necessarily be something otherwise that I would pick up. And then I read Rust in the Root earlier this year, which still is my #1 favorite book so far this year. The thing that made me hesitate with this, not the fact that it's alternative history, it's zombies. I don't do zombies. Zombies are not, they're my least favorite fantastical, paranormal, whatever you want to say, creature. I do not like zombies. This has zombies in it. The undead. Because it's set in the 1880s, I think, And the Civil War never technically ended because I forget which battle it was, but Gettysburg maybe, instead of the dead staying dead, they rise up and they're zombies. And now everyone's like, okay, we should probably stop fighting each other and start figuring out how to kill the dead again before they kill us. And so this whole structure of things has arisen. And the main character is in her last year at this combat school where Native Americans, well, not her school, but there are various combat schools set up throughout the United States. And the people that go there are the lowest of the low. They are the formerly enslaved, the free blacks, the Native Americans, etc. And they are trained in combat and how to kill what they call shamblers and to be attendants for the wealthy and keep them safe. And a whole bunch of stuff unfolds in this book. And I cannot wait to read the sequel. I think it's going to be phenomenal. I'm so glad that I decided to pick it up. I forget where I picked it up, but I picked it up recently. From the outset, I love the voice that Justina Ireland gives to the main character. Obviously, I can't remember the name. I've read so many books lately. But anyway, I love the voice that she gives to her. I love the way that the story unfolded. Each of these chapters would start with a snippet from letters that she was sending back to her mom, who is the mistress of a plantation. Yeah, there was a lot of controversy around her birth. And also her mom's letters back to her, because there was a period of time where she wasn't getting letters, but she had kept sending them. And then there's just a series of things that unfold through this. And the way that, and this is something that I loved in Rust in the Root as well, the way that Justina Ireland takes these settings and takes the more fantastical, more sci-fi, the alternative, and uses them to talk about history and illuminate, reveal things that were happening then, but also make parallels to things happening today. At one point, there was something very subtle that she mentioned, and I had to look up when this book was published, and it was published in 2018, meaning she probably wrote it in most of 2017. And the thing that's mentioned there, I'm not going to mention what it was, but it was very subtle. It wasn't emphasized on. It's not like she's banging you over the head with all of these different analogies and parallels that she's drawing. I'm like, I see what you're doing there. I get that. And I love that sort of connection. It fits right in. This, I think, out of the 3 Justina Ireland books that I've read thus far, is the third. I still rated it 5 stars. I've rated all 3 books that I've read by her 5 stars. This just barely got 5 stars. And I think that's because of how Ireland handles some of the reveals that happen at the end of the book. There are some things that happen that they make sense when you think about it going back further in the story, but they feel like they come out of nowhere and that they're plot conveniences when they happen, even though they make sense. And so because of that, even though it makes sense and it expands the story and gives more potential for things, it felt a little bit weird, but that was the only thing that I didn't like about this. Fantastic book. I'm going to, while I remember, talk about the other audiobook that I have finished. I'm about halfway through a third. The other audiobook that I finished was actually an advanced listening copy provided on Libro FM. Every month I get access to their educator, ALC's advanced listener copies, and I'll go through, and I have a whole bunch since I started this, like back in January, that are on there. And I decided, you know what? I should probably start listening to these. And I also, because I started this on Friday night, the book on Friday night, I'm like, there's not that many days before the next month. So let me find something that's not on May's TBR to read. And that book that I found, what is Gentrification is Inevitable and Other Lies. One of the things that struck me with the situational irony is the fact that literally that day in class, I had been talking about gentrification and other parts about the city that she was talking about in this book. And I really appreciated what Kearns did with, she had a very clear outline. She set up the different quote unquote lies about gentrification and this idea that she was going to use for each chapter and then talk about and disprove. And the only thing that I didn't like because of the format that I was listening to is the fact that there are a lot of footnotes, but they're the kind of footnotes that I used when I was writing historical papers. They're not more explanatory footnotes. They are most likely the citation footnotes, and it wouldn't make sense in an audiobook to read out because you'd have author, then piece name and publication and date, etc. But what happened in the audiobook was she'd say the sentence and then endnote number or footnote number, whatever it was, and just go on. And at first I'm like, well, where's the footnote? Are you going to tell me that it's done? And then I figured out, okay, she's just reading out that there is a footnote. And that would not have been a problem had I read this book physically. But I did appreciate that those were in there because it told me, reading this book as an audiobook, this is well researched. Now, I need to go in and look at those actual citations, but she had so many citations throughout this. There was a review that I saw that said that it wasn't well researched, and I'm like, did we read the same book? Because there was a lot of evidence that supported this. One of the things that I really wish more of these sorts of nonfiction books do is not only lay out the problem, but also give action points, like concrete action points that you can take and think about and move forward. And that's how she had the book laid out. She had the quote unquote lies that she was disproving, and then she ended with, here's what we can do to both continue to disprove those lies, but also change the situation going forward. And I really enjoyed it. This will probably be one that I'm going to put on my wish list and get a physical copy. Now to the other 3 physical books that I read, and these are all 3 physical copies of ARCs that I have that I've been needing to read. And the first of those is A Woman's Life is a Human Life. This came out in January, the first Tuesday of January. I really need to get this back to the library because this was a 2-week loan and I got this at the beginning of the month, so it is now 2 weeks overdue. So you will see me in this particular outfit for one of the clips for my wrap up. I'm not going to film my wrap up yet, but I am going to film for this book so that I can return it. So in this book, Felicia Kornbluh is uniquely poised to tell the story of, as she says, my mother, our neighbor, and the journey from reproductive rights to reproductive justice. So she's telling the story about a whole lot of issues surrounding reproductive freedom for women. She's uniquely set up to tell this story because not only is she a historian by training, but her mother was one of the key movers and drivers for the key legislation that happened in New York State in 1970, 3 years before Roe versus Wade. And also their neighbor across the street was a key mover in revealing all of the horrors and injustices that happened to Puerto Rican women and sort of the forced sterilization side of it that went, the racial side of it. And so she's like right there, personal connections, but also she has a historian's training. And you could tell that in this book. And I have to admit, I wanted to be able to engage more with this book than I was able to. For some reason, I don't know what it was, I kept falling asleep while I was reading it and also not necessarily engaging with it so that some of the ideas stuck in my brain. Kornbluh fills the text with all sorts of stories and evidence and points, and it's jam-packed. It's a lot. And I think that the times when I was reading it, my brain was not capable of processing that much information. There's a lot in here. And one thing that I really appreciated is so many people boil down this whole idea about reproductive freedom to Roe versus Wade. I've listened to a lot of different podcasts that talk about both Jane Roe, that was a pseudonym, but the actual woman, and her journey both before and after. They talk about the court case. They talk about different actors involved in it, but they don't necessarily talk about the other aspects. They don't talk about the various laws and women who are fighting for both abortion access, but also for the access for women for good medical care. The lack of access and resources that women have had in this area because of a lot of superstitions and bigotry and misogyny is horrific. I read the book, I think it was a couple months ago, Take My Hand by Doris Perkins Valdez, that was based on the story that she refers to in here about a case where two African American sisters, very young, were sterilized without knowing it when they were like 15 and 13. And there's so much that goes into that, and so much of the fight and how it was used and taken and twisted and ignored. And when certain people got involved, other people used that to dismiss different things. There's a wealth of information in here. And I think it was just the situation where my brain was just already sort of full and couldn't take in everything. This is a very solid work on the topic. I think I'm gonna get a physical copy or an audio copy and listen to it some other time. I don't know when during the year, because I think that might be a better way for me to consume the information. Next, we have Comet Madness by Richard J. Goodrich. And this was fascinating. This was another science-y sort of book. I've read a couple of those this month, the best being The Song of the Cell by Siddhartha Mukherjee. This one, obviously much shorter and a different area of science. This is all about Halley's Comet. Goodrich gives a little bit of background, both in the comet and Halley and another one of the astronomers involved in the story. But he also tells about all these different people that were involved in this. I mean, the title is very apropos. This madness. People didn't know, so people were just getting more and more scientific information and was becoming more well known on a mass scale, but the information that they had and the tools with which they had to gather it were insufficient. And there were a lot of gaps in their knowledge, and so people filled in those gaps with all sorts of hysteria. And it was so fascinating to read. Yet at the same time, it was kind of boring. I don't think he broke a lot of new ground, but he retread a lot of the same stories. I'm like, okay, are we done yet? Are we done yet? Are we done yet? I was interested in it until about like page 200, but then the last 50 pages just drag and drag and drag and drag. I would have appreciated a little bit more context about the 1986 return of Halley's Comet to compare the reactions between the two. We just didn't get it. It was fine. I enjoyed my read, but it didn't stand out and it didn't wow me. If the angle changed at all, I had to change the battery. So I have one more book left. Of course, the battery dies before the last book. And that is Nearer My Freedom. Technically, so it's The Interesting Life of Olaudah Equiano by himself. So the book, okay. So it's interesting that I'm having this much trouble just reading this. What this book is something that I didn't know existed before, and that is something called found verse. And so in found verse, it's where people take writing that already exists and they turn it into free verse. And so what Monica Edinger and Leslie Young did is they took the autobiography of Equiano and they turned it into free verse, okay, that you can see here. And it read so well, but I don't know how I feel about found verse, because obviously Equiano wrote it how he wrote it, and it was him telling his story, and those are his words about his life. And you have people coming 2-3 centuries later taking those words and rearranging them. Now, they do at the end of the book talk about their process. And so they have this here. They write about it, and then they take, so this is an excerpt, obviously, from his autobiography, and the bolded text is what they use. So you can tell there's a lot of text on the page that they don't use. And then what you're left with is this here. And that was from 2 pages. You get the basic gist of the story, and it reads really well. And the words that they are using are his words. They're just not all of his words, and they're in a different order, which I don't know how I feel about that. Now, I will say, I have read the original. I've read his autobiography, and this definitely is a lot more understandable and approachable. And as I looked up some information, this is targeted at a YA audience, so I can completely understand why they would want to transform it into a type of text that would definitely be readable for young adults today, high schoolers, middle schoolers, etc. Because once you get a couple centuries separated from the text, the level of writing, a computer may say it's, you know, 9th grade level, but the syntax and the words used are not used in common day, and so it's almost incomprehensible to people who don't have this sort of training and don't have an advanced reading level, which I could get off on a tangent on about the texts that are used in testing, because they use stuff that's in the public domain, which is older, but that would be a side tangent for sure. So I find myself conflicted, because I think it did a really good job and it stuck true to his story, but there's a lot left out. I did also appreciate that periodically they would insert more information, both either about Equiano or about the time period. So I think this is a good book. I just don't know completely how I feel about Found Verse itself. Clearly, they give credit where credit is due. I just don't know how I feel about it. How many more times can I say that? I don't know. So there you have it. There are the 7 books that I read this week. I had a pretty good reading week. A 5-star, well, I had an average reading week, with the average bumped up by my 5-star. The rest were about 3.5, 4 stars. So, but it was a good reading week, and I got a lot read, and I think I'm up to 33 books in the month, maybe 34. Yeah, I think I need to slow down my reading so that I can fully comprehend what I'm reading. We'll see if I do that or not. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.